Alrighty, y'all. So welcome to lesson 4.9. So notice that lesson 4.9 is a little bit different because we're kind of putting together everything that we've learned so far about the periodic table and ions in order to identify the unknown ion, either one of these five, that's causing our patient's symptoms, right? So after watching this video, you're going to look at your own patients. Either you have patient A in blue or you have patient B shown in purple, right? So after watching this video, you should be able to identify for yourself what's causing the patient's symptoms. So recall that throughout this unit, we've started talking about ions, and ions are just salts or electrolytes that our body needs in order to function. And we often feel the effects of a lack of ions if we're playing sports and then we randomly have a muscle spasm, right? And that's telling us we're probably missing one or many of these ions, and we're usually losing them when we sweat them out, right? And that's why your sweat tastes kind of salty, right? Okay, so beyond these ions and symptoms, we also learned about things in the periodic table that is going to help us solve for this, right? So in this lesson, you're going to learn 3 tests that we're going to do and check for in order to figure out which one of these 5 ions that we as human beings need in our body is causing this particular patient's symptoms, right? So I want to make a little notes that we don't really use part 2 when we're diagnosing patient symptoms just because it doesn't really make sense, but we're also in chemistry class, so we kind of need to talk about metals, nonmetals, and metalloids, right? So part 2 is kind of like bleh. The most useful one is probably part 3, right? Okay, so let's start with part 1, where we analyze our patient's symptoms, right? And if you recall in previous performance tasks, right, for each part, all the directions are in blue, and then questions you have to answer are in red, and you would type in your answer in the box that's highlighted in green, right? And notice that for each of these, if you don't remember these lessons, I've also linked the Nearpod lesson video for you to revisit these lessons that will also help you solve, right? So starting with part 1, analyzing or guessing the patient's symptoms. So what you're going to do is you're going to read over the doctor's notes and then take notes of what symptoms our patient has, right? So in this case, the patient shows signs of low blood pressure, irregular heartbeat, confusion. Patient could state their name but not state today's date. Patient seemed disoriented because they were unaware of their location. Breathing was also slowed. So as I'm reading this, something that I would recommend doing is whenever you see a symptom, go ahead and type that down below so that you know what you're looking for when you're looking for the symptoms later on, right? So the symptoms that I caught were low blood pressure, irregular heartbeat, confusion, slow breathing, and I noted that they took large amount of vitamins, right? So for you, don't feel like you need to catch all of the symptoms. Just find what you can find. And once we find these symptoms based off of the doctor's notes, we're going to go ahead and open up the biological ions charts. So recall that when we did this for Nearpod lesson 4.2, right, these are the symptoms if the patient has too little of an ion. And this last column are the symptoms if a patient has too much of this ion, right? And what ion were we talking about? Well, if you look to the left, this is the ion, right? So I noted that the symptoms are low blood pressure, irregular heartbeat, and confusion. There's a whole bunch more, but I'm just gonna look for those specifically. And to help me out, I'm just gonna split my screen. Okay, so now that I've split my screen in half like this, right, I can look at the patient symptoms that I've listed on the left and then compare them to the ions and the symptoms on the right, right? So I'm looking for low blood pressure, irregular heartbeats, and confusion. So here I have high blood pressure. There's confusion here, so maybe it has something to do with Na plus, but it's missing the other symptoms. So I'm just going to skip this one. This one has a regular heartbeat. This one also has a regular heartbeat, so maybe it's related to K. So as you're noting this, right, feel free to type it in the side. So K plus has irregular heartbeats, no other symptoms. MG has irregular heartbeat, low blood pressure, confusion, and slow breathing. Hey, that is a lot of the symptoms, specifically 4. So I'm going to write on the side that MG in the high concentration column, so all the symptoms came from here, where there's a high concentration or a lot of Mg if you have too much magnesium. High concentration. That's 4 of the symptoms. So that's a good sign. It's not a good sign, but it's helpful. So here, moving on to this one, what do we got here? So CA, muscle twitching, dry skin. There's no symptoms of that. Thirst, nausea, confusion, and lightheadedness. That's only one of the symptoms. Numbness, blah, blah, confusion. And this one, feeling dehydrated. So no symptoms there and one symptom there. So K has one symptom. What's this one? CL has one symptom. And CA has one symptom. So K plus CA and CL have one of the symptoms. Okay. So right now, based off of the symptoms only, I think the patients might either have too much or a high concentration of Mg because the patient shows the signs of 4 of the symptoms. Right. It might also be Ca, Cl, or K because there's one symptom of each. All right, so I'm abbreviating a lot here, but I would definitely go into a little more detail with how do you know what symptom are you actually looking at, and is there too much or too little of calcium, chlorine, or K, right? Potassium. Right. Okay. So that's part 1. We're just looking at the symptoms to try to guess at which ones of the 5 could it be. So we've narrowed it down to maybe these 3, but again, we're not really sure. So let's move on to part 2 to help us narrow this down even more. Right. So in part 2, I've listed a data table for you to test the results of an unknown ion. And we're going to use the data table to determine whether the ion causing our patient's issues is a metal, nonmetal, or metalloid. So you might notice that of the 5 ions, right, some of these are metals and some of these are non-metals. Right. And if you don't remember how to tell whether something is a metal or a non-metal, I would highly recommend you watch Nearpod lesson 4.6, right? So in part 1, we narrowed it down to Ca, Cl, or K, right? And of those three, I can find them on the periodic table, right? So Ca is here, Cl is here, and K is here. So if you recall, you might want to rewatch Nearpod lesson 4.6, that K and Ca, these two are on the metal side, and Cl is a non-metal, right? It's on the non-metal side. And remember that this is the zigzag line that separates them, right? So if I know that it's a metal, then I can say it's either one of these two probably. And if I know that it's a non-metal, then my guess is it's probably Cl that's causing the patient problems, right? So let's go ahead and look at the data in part 2. So in part 2, it says it reacts with copper chloride, and the answer is yes. So yes, it does react with copper chloride. Reactivity with acids, yes, it also reacts with acid. So if you have no idea what this means, rewatch this video, right? So from here, I can tell that the unknown ion causing our patient problems is a metal. I'm going to tell you why. I'm going to leave that blank, right? Because that's for you to figure out for your patients, right? So therefore, the unknown ion is a metal, meaning it could be Ca or K. So that's my guess.